Hi everyone, I'm very sorry not to be in Beijing, but this is an alternative way of trying to have contact. When you see this, then probably in half an hour from now, I'll be online if everything works well. So let's try to do it in this way. I want to talk about the governance of global health, why it is important, and why it's also a bit problematic right now. So, global health, when we talk about global health, what exactly are we talking about? We can see that the terminology or the expression is relatively new. Until recently, we talked about international health, and since the 90s and let's say the year 2000, the new millennium, global health is becoming a much more important expression than international health. Is it only a change of words, or is something else behind it? I think there is more than just a terminology. There is a change of philosophy, perhaps, a new way of looking at responsibilities, who exactly is responsible for health, and a lot of things come from that. So the first thing we can see, if we try to compare what has changed since global health has taken over from international health, well, perhaps the most obvious change is a quite substantial increase in international assistance for health, or here it's named Development Assistance for Health, DAH. Since the 90s until 2010, so in 20 years, an increase from 5 billion to 27 billion almost. Gigantic increase. And it's not just the money that has changed. But before we go into there, I want to mention a small warning here. These are figures estimated where the money leaves the country. So this is measured within the so-called donor countries, and a lot of money never arrives in the so-called developing countries. So later we'll talk about the other side, how much external money is actually used in developing countries. And so those figures will be quite different. But nonetheless, in orders of magnitude, since we're talking about global health rather than international health, the international assistance, the international financing has increased quite dramatically and substantially. Now, why is that so? Because there is this underlying idea that in the end, health is a national responsibility. Health is a responsibility of a government towards their people. And that thinking, which is still somehow present, but which is losing some of its power, that principle has implications for sustainability. Sustainability is a very important term, a very important notion in international assistance for health. And this is a quote from a WHO, World Health Organization manual on disrupted health sectors, where the authors say, sustainability is continuously invoked as a key criterion to assess any aid-induced activity or initiative. Sometimes the concept is given the weight of a decisive argument. So to declare something unsustainable may sound as equivalent to worthless or even harmful. So the idea really is that whatever project, whatever new intervention you want to promote, ultimately the country has to pay for it itself, otherwise it is not sustainable. And of course, behind that, there is a philosophy that is expressed in these words. For example, if you give a man a fish, you feed him for a day. Teach a man how to fish, you feed him for a lifetime. And so the idea of international health is that, yes, richer countries should help poorer countries to learn how to fish, but without giving them fish. To learn them how to build better health systems, but without financing salaries, without financing recurrent expenditure like medicines, etc. And of course, that's a nice philosophy, but that has some consequences. That has some consequences, especially for low-income countries. And these are estimates. They're a bit outdated, but they're the most recent estimates that I could find on the World Bank um, website on government revenue without grants in percentage of GDP. So this is the revenue of countries, taxation, but some other tariffs, other sources of revenue, but excluding international assistance. And so for high-income countries, it's 25% of GDP. For upper middle income, it's 18 and so on. For low-income countries, it is only 11% of GDP. Now, what is GDP? GDP is the gross domestic product. So that's an estimate of all the economic activity in that country. And 11% on average in low-income countries of that activity goes to the government through taxes. That's the government revenue. And then I added some more specific countries. In Benin, it's a bit better. It's 17%, Burkina Faso 13, 18. Let's say that on general, low-income countries will not go, or it will be very difficult to go beyond 20%. Now then, when you see what the economic activity is worth, that is the GDP per capita or the GDP per person, high-income countries on average 31,000. This is in dollars. Low-income country, $309 on average. The government revenue then in low-income countries is $35 on average. Again, this is only an average. In Benin, it's $94. In Burkina Faso, it's 48, and in Uganda, 31. But it gives you a reasonable idea on what is possible in these countries. Now remember, this is the government budget, not for health. This is the government budget for everything, for the police, for the army, for education, for so many other things. And so the money for health that comes out of that will be probably around 10%. And so we did some calculations using the national health accounts of 1999. And when we tried to measure there what the health expenditure is from the government, it's actually quite low. It's now I have to look. So the per capita total health expenditure is $10 or was $10 in 1999, of which the government health expenditure was about 40%. So $4. $4 was the government expenditure. And so if you then apply this expression or the spirit of you should not hand out fish, you should teach people or countries how to fish themselves, then the room for international assistance, the space for international assistance is quite low. Because the more assistance you give, the more you make the country depending on international assistance. And if the national budget is only $4, then perhaps you can add $1 or $2. And that's effectively what happened when we tried to calculate how much of the real expenditure in that country, in these countries, comes from international assistance. It's actually very low. It's $1.4 per person per year. And even if wealthier countries would be willing to give more to those very poor countries, the low-income countries, as long as you aim for national self-reliance, it's very difficult to imagine giving more. Another effect of this aim for sustainability, for financial autonomy, is that a lot of international assistance will be used primarily for investment. There will be a reluctance to use it for salaries, medicines, and things like that. Now, of course, this is problematic because expenditure is not the only factor that counts when you want to improve health, but it is a relatively important one. And on this map, you see in red and in orange the countries where total health expenditure is less than $50 per person per year. And on the next one, you see the under 5 mortality in the world. And those are not exactly the same countries. I will go back to the previous map, but it is more or less in the same region. So we can say that below $50 or certainly below $25, it's very difficult to produce good health, to deliver good health services, and to make people healthier. If you stick then to the idea of self-reliance, of financial autonomy, it's very difficult to change this. You just have to accept this. Now, what changed and why did we see this important increase in international assistance? I think a lot of the change has to do with the epidemic of HIV/AIDS. The epidemic of HIV/AIDS was really a game changer because it made people aware, I think, that this whole idea of teach them how to fish may not work in some countries, and it may not work for the simple reason that too many people were dying. And this is an estimate of the changes in life expectancy in some countries in Southern Africa, and it's quite dramatic. I mean, if life expectancy, take Kenya, decreases from 55 years to 45 years or even below, then in the long run, something is going wrong with the economy. Parents don't live long enough to help their children to go to school, to get a decent education, to become more productive. There's a risk that these societies are falling apart. So the whole idea of development assistance and to make countries more autonomous was problematic because the very low budget in a country like Kenya meant that it could not afford antiretroviral treatment. And antiretroviral treatment was too expensive, therefore international financing was needed, but then international finance would create a dependency, and so we arrive at a loophole, an intellectual loophole. There's no easy solution. Something else happened too, and it is around this epidemic, we saw a change in civil society, perhaps a creation of a global civil society, of a global movement of activism, which is nicely expressed by this campaign, this idea, we all have AIDS if one of us does. And of course, it's a slogan, but I think it means something, and I would love to see a similar campaign saying we all need a cesarean section if one of us does, but I haven't seen that. I mean, this is really typically AIDS activism. So the idea that we're all in the same boat with this disease, we're all part of the same community, and therefore it doesn't really matter that some countries are too poor to pay for the AIDS treatment. This is a global responsibility. Now, I'm not sure if this would have worked only because of the activism and because of the sense that development was not going to work. I think something that was also important was the idea that AIDS was a security issue, not only for the countries with a very high prevalence, but a human and national security for other countries as well. And so this United Nations Special Session on HIV/AIDS of June 2001, which really changed the global response to AIDS, was not just a meeting of solidarity, it was also a meeting of global crisis with global risks for everyone, and therefore global action. So we are moving away from this idea every country has to take care of its own problems, but to the realization this is a global problem, this is a global crisis, and it requires global action, and it requires global responsibility. And what we saw indeed, if we're now doing the same calculations, but for 2009, before we were looking at 1999, well, international assistance has increased quite spectacularly. If we calculate it per person per year in low-income countries, it is now $6.70. And of course, we can say this is still a very low amount of money if we compare it with the richness of the high-income countries, but it is 4 times what it was in 1999, and it is almost half of government health expenditure or more in some of the low-income countries. So we have somehow abandoned the idea that countries should finance their health systems and their health services themselves. It has now become a global responsibility that is globally financed. But one of the problems with this is that most of this increase in international assistance went to HIV/AIDS, to malaria, and to tuberculosis. A little bit, or similarly, to health sector support, but perhaps most of that money was to strengthen the health sector to deal specifically with those infectious diseases, and far less for non-communicable diseases and for maternal, newborn and child health. And of course, if you think it through, then this makes sense. It makes sense from the perspective of the rich countries because communicable diseases cross borders. So that's another way of saying this is our common problem. We are financing, we're not assisting countries, we are financing a joint response to a problem that we have in common. And that is true for infectious diseases, but it's not so clear for maternal health. So from that perspective, it could make sense. If you use a human rights perspective, however, a right to health perspective or a justice perspective, then this is very difficult to defend. This is very difficult to justify in the long run that in the same countries you will find money for AIDS treatment, but not enough resources for emergency obstetric care. So what to do about this? Most of you who have read my papers before know that I'm very much in favor of creating a kind of global social protection mechanism for health, a global fund for health in general, for health systems, and not only for single diseases. And it's been considered very utopian, but I feel quite relieved to see that other people are even far more utopian than I am, because this came out just a couple of days ago. A proposal by the UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Food and the UN Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights, calling for a global fund for social protection. And this is far more ambitious than what I had in mind. But it could be the ultimate consequence of going for global responsibility, not only for health, but for poverty, for education, for other essential human rights. I guess the main problem, and now we're coming at the issue of global governance, is that we don't have a global government. For this kind of fund, we need decisions on which countries should contribute, how much should they contribute, which countries should benefit most, how do we deal with problems of accountability, how do we deal with problems of corruption, can we make this kind of trade-offs or negotiations where you say, well, in countries where the rights of gay people are not respected, we don't have to finance for healthcare. I mean, normally at the national level, this would be discussed in a parliament, and people may have disagreements, but ultimately there will be a decision that is representing everyone. At the global level, we don't have that. And so I guess that's a challenge. It's very difficult or uncomfortable to be in the situation of a country where half of your health expenditure depends on decisions taken in other countries, by other democracies, in other parliaments. And so we need something, we need a mechanism of governance to deal with this. And perhaps the ideal one, or the most democratic one, would be the World Health Organization, where each country has one vote. But I don't think it's a coincidence that the World Health Organization has not been used for this. I think it represents a reluctance of the rich countries to give their money to a mechanism where the developing countries, the poorer countries, have the vast majority. And this is a bit of the political realism. Of course, from a principle point of view, this is very questionable. I mean, it's questionable to move away from WHO for this perspective, but I think that this is what happened. The Global Fund has a board. Um, Global Fund is one of those new mechanisms, not the only one, but perhaps the biggest one. Has a board that is composed, let's say, half of the votes go to the wealthier countries of the world, and the other half go to the poorer countries of the world, the so-called developing countries. Now, it's not exactly democratic if you know that the so-called developed countries have 1 billion inhabitants and the others have almost 6 billion. And so it's not very equal. But the alternative at that time was the World Bank. And the World Bank is perhaps even less democratic because the 1 billion people living in developed countries have 75 to 80% of the votes in the World Bank. But if you take a bit of distance from the principles, it's easy to understand that the richer countries who want to control what happens to their money, what happens with their money, will say, well, we are accountable to our taxpayers, and so we want to put this in a system where we can be accountable. And so I think this is hugely problematic. I don't want to use simple statements, but I want to invite you to have a discussion about this, because this whole idea of global health, global responsibility for health, global funds, not even only for health, but for social protection, it has a very attractive side. The attractiveness is that we would finally have a global system of responsibility. And I think human rights, the essence of saying that something is a human right, is that whole humanity is responsible for that. So in principle, I'm in favor. But at the same time, it does create a challenge of governance. It's not so simple to imagine the right tools, the right mechanisms to do this as it should be done. And so I think here we're in the middle of a process at the international level that is struggling with it, that is taking a few steps forward and then backwards. But there are no easy solutions. And so I hope you will have a good discussion on that, and I will be available for your questions, and I hope I will be able to participate in the discussion as well if the techniques allow it. Okay, talk to you later. Bye. So how long was that?
Let's see.